They called her crazy when a female mechanic bought a crumbling abandoned orphanage for next to nothing. "What's she gonna do with that haunted place?" they whispered. "It's been empty for decades." But what they didn't know was that buried within those decaying walls, hidden in forgotten rooms and dusty corners, lay secrets that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her own life. This isn't just a story about buying property. It's about discovering that sometimes the past refuses to stay buried, and sometimes the answers you've been searching for your entire life are hidden in the last place you'd ever think to look. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn rain hammered against the cracked windows of Mason's Automotive as Sarah Chen wiped her grease-stained hands on a worn shop rag. At 32, she had built a reputation as one of the most skilled mechanics in Millfield, a Rust Belt town where factories had closed and dreams seemed to follow suit. Her small garage sat on the corner of Oak and 3rd, squeezed between a laundromat that never seemed to have customers and a diner that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Sarah had inherited the garage from her mentor, Old Pete, who'd taught her everything about engines, transmissions, and the delicate art of coaxing life back into machines that others had given up on. Pete had been more than a boss. He'd been the closest thing to family she'd ever known. When he passed 2 years ago, he left her the shop, his tools, and a handwritten note that simply said, "Fix what's broken, kid. That's what we do." But lately, Sarah felt like she was the thing that needed fixing. Every night, she'd lock up the garage and walk the 6 blocks to her studio apartment above the pharmacy, carrying the same questions that had haunted her since childhood. Who were her real parents? Why had she been left at St. Catherine's Children's Home when she was just 3 days old? The nuns had told her she was found on the steps with nothing but a blanket and a note that said, "Please love her like I cannot." She'd spent countless hours searching through records, hiring private investigators with money she couldn't afford to spend, and following leads that always seemed to evaporate like morning fog. Every dead end felt like another door slamming shut on the truth about where she came from. It was Mrs. Rodriguez from the diner who first mentioned the Hartwell estate. Sarah was grabbing her usual Tuesday coffee when the older woman leaned across the counter, her voice dropping to that conspiratorial whisper reserved for the town's biggest gossip. "You know that old orphanage out on Maple Ridge Road? The Hartwell place?" Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of someone about to share particularly juicy information. "The family's finally selling. Been sitting empty since, must be 25 years now, ever since that scandal broke and they shut it down." Sarah's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "What kind of scandal?" "Oh, honey, where do I even start? The Hartwells ran that place for 3 generations. Started in the 1920s as a home for orphan children. Seemed like such a noble family, always in the church, always donating to charity. But toward the end, there were whispers. Money missing, children disappearing from the records, families asking questions that never got answered. Leaned closer. Then one day, the whole family just vanished, left everything behind, furniture, records, even family photos still hanging on the walls. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She found herself driving out to Maple Ridge Road, following the winding path that led away from town and into the hills where old money used to build their estates. The Hartwell orphanage sat at the end of a tree-lined drive, 3 stories of Victorian Gothic architecture that seemed to loom against the starless sky. Even in the darkness, she could see the building's bones were good. Solid brick construction, tall windows, a wraparound porch that spoke of summers when children might have played in the yard. But 25 years of abandonment had taken their toll. Ivy crawled up the walls like grasping fingers, shutters hung at odd angles, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had weathered to gray. A for sale sign leaned precariously near the front gate, the realtor's phone number barely visible beneath years of weather damage. Sarah pulled out her phone and took a picture, though she wasn't sure why. She certainly didn't have money for a massive renovation project. Hell, she was still paying off the loan she had taken to upgrade the garage's equipment. But something about the place called to her. Maybe it was the way the moonlight caught the stained glass window above the front door, casting colored shadows across the porch. Maybe it was the fact that this had been a place where lost children found homes, just like she had been a lost child herself. Or maybe it was something deeper, something she couldn't name but felt in her bones. The next morning, she called the realtor. Jim Bradshaw had a voice like gravel, and the enthusiasm of someone who'd been trying to sell the same property for too long. The Hartwell place? Jesus, Sarah, I haven't had a serious inquiry in months. Place needs a fortune in work. Roof has got leaks, foundation is settling, and don't get me started on the electrical system. It's been on the market for 3 years now, and the family's getting desperate. They just want it gone. When he named the price, Sarah nearly dropped the phone. It was less than what most people paid for a decent car. The catch, of course, was that whoever bought it would be inheriting a money pit that could drain bank accounts faster than a broken transmission. "I want to see it," she heard herself saying. "Sarah, honey, I like you, but this place isn't for someone looking for a weekend project. We're talking about a full-scale renovation that could cost more than the building's worth. I want to see it anyway." That afternoon, Jim met her at the property with a ring of keys that looked like they belonged in a museum. The front door stuck, swollen from years of moisture, and when it finally gave way, the smell hit her immediately. Not decay or mold like she'd expected, but something else. Old wood, leather, and something faintly sweet like flowers left too long in a vase. The interior took her breath away. The main foyer stretched up 3 stories with a grand staircase that curved gracefully toward the upper floors. Despite the dust and the sheets draped over furniture, she could see the craftsmanship that had gone into every detail. Hand-carved banisters, intricate crown molding, hardwood floors that had probably been beautiful before decades of neglect. Jim led her through room after room, a dining hall with tables still set for meals that would never be served, a library with empty shelves and reading nooks built into alcoves, dormitories filled with iron bed frames that seemed to wait for children who would never return. The family left everything, Jim explained as they climbed to the second floor. Furniture, books, even personal belongings. Legal mess took years to sort out, and by the time the estate was settled, nobody wanted to deal with hauling it all away. In what had once been the director's office, Sarah found herself drawn to a massive oak desk covered with papers that had yellowed with age. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves still held leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked but titles still legible. A portrait hung above the mantelpiece, a stern-looking man with deep-set eyes and a beard, wearing the formal attire of someone accustomed to authority. "That's Jeremiah Hartwell," Jim said, following her gaze. "Founded the place back in 1923. His son Robert took over in the 50s, then Robert's daughter Margaret ran it until the end. 3 generations of Hartwells, all dedicated to helping orphan children find families." Sarah stared at the portrait, and for a moment something flickered in her memory. Those eyes seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. She turned away, unsettled by the feeling that the painted gaze was following her movements. They spent 2 hours exploring the building. Jim showed her the industrial kitchen, the common rooms, the smaller offices where caseworkers had once matched children with families. Every room told a story of institutional care. Not unkind, but impersonal in the way that places housing dozens of children inevitably became. It was in the basement that Sarah made her decision. What had once been storage and utility rooms had been converted into a workshop, not unlike my own garage, but larger and better equipped. Someone had installed proper ventilation, heavy-duty electrical outlets, and workbenches that ran along 3 walls. Tools still hung on pegboards, and parts bins were labeled in neat handwriting. Ms. Hartwell was quite the mechanic herself, had a garage in town before she took over the orphanage. Guess she couldn't give up working with her hands entirely. Standing in that basement workshop, surrounded by tools and the ghost of another woman who'd chosen to fix things rather than throw them away, Sarah felt something click into place. This wasn't just about buying property. This was about finding where she belonged. "I'll take it," she said. Jim's eyebrows shot up. "Sarah, you need to think about this. Get inspections, estimates, maybe consult with contractors about what you're looking at cost-wise." "I'll take it," she repeated, more firmly this time. The paperwork took 3 weeks. Sarah liquidated her savings account, took out a loan against the garage, and called in favors from every contractor she'd ever done work for. When the keys were finally hers, she stood alone in the foyer of the Hartwell orphanage, listening to the silence that seemed to pulse with decades of memories. She started with the basics, getting the utilities turned on, assessing which rooms were safe to occupy, and creating a plan for making the place livable. The roof leaked in 17 different places, the plumbing hadn't been updated since the 1960s, and the electrical system was a fire hazard waiting to happen. But every evening, after 12-hour days of repair work, Sarah found herself drawn to explore the building more thoroughly. She discovered a conservatory filled with dead plants and broken pottery, a music room with a piano that still held its tune despite being desperately out of tune, and a library where children's books lay scattered across tables as if their young readers had just stepped away for recess. It was in that library, 3 weeks after moving in, that Sarah found the first diary. She'd been installing new lighting when she knocked over a stack of books hidden behind a radiator. As she bent to pick them up, she noticed that one wasn't a book at all, but a leather-bound journal with "Property of M. Hartwell" embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering. Inside, the pages were filled with Margaret Hartwell's neat handwriting, dating back to 1985. Sarah read the first entry by lamplight, sitting cross-legged on the dusty library floor. October 3rd, 1985. Another sleepless night. The guilt eats at me like acid. How many more children will I have to turn away because of what we've done? How many more families will ask questions I cannot answer? Father started this practice, Robert continued it, and now I'm trapped in a web of lies that grows stronger every day. But if I stop now, if I confess what we've been doing, it won't just destroy me. It will destroy every family we've helped create, every child we've placed in what they believe is their rightful home. Sarah's hands trembled as she read those words. What practice? What lies? What had the Hartwells been doing that caused such guilt? She stayed up until dawn reading, discovering entry after entry that hinted at secrets buried deep within the orphanage's operations. Margaret wrote about children whose records had been altered, about birth certificates that told different stories than the truth, about families who'd paid premiums for children who matched their specific requirements. And then, in an entry dated March 15, 1987, Sarah found the words that stopped her heart. The Chen baby arrived today. Another private arrangement, another family desperate for a child who looks like them. Sometimes I wonder if these children are better off not knowing the truth about how they came to their families. The lies we tell become the foundation of their entire lives. Sarah dropped the diary, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Chen. Her surname, the surname she'd been given at St. Catherine's because no one knew her real name. She picked up the diary with shaking hands and continued reading, discovering that Margaret Hartwell had documented everything: names, dates, the complex network of illegal adoptions that had made the Hartwell orphanage profitable for 3 generations. As the sun rose through the library windows, Sarah realized that buying this place hadn't been chance or coincidence. Somehow, she'd been drawn back to the place where her story began, to the secrets that had shaped her entire life without her knowing. The building she'd bought to renovate was about to give her something far more valuable than a home. It was about to give her the truth. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The discovery of her own surname in Margaret Hartwell's diary hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. She sat on the cold library floor, surrounded by dust motes dancing in the morning light, holding a piece of paper that might contain the answers she'd spent her entire life searching for. But reading those words, "The Chen baby arrived today," felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. She closed the diary and pressed it against her chest, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. For 32 years, she'd been Sarah Chen, the orphan who'd built a life from nothing. Now, in the span of a single night, everything she thought she knew about herself had been called into question. The rational part of her mind whispered caution. Chen was a common surname. This could be a coincidence, a cruel trick of fate that had led her to buy the one building that might contain references to another abandoned child who happened to share her name. But deep in her bones, she knew better. The timing, the circumstances, the inexplicable pull she'd felt toward this place, it all pointed to something bigger than chance. Sarah spent the rest of that morning combing through the library with methodical precision. She pulled books from every shelf, checked behind radiators and under loose floorboards, searching for more hidden diaries. Margaret Hartwell had been meticulous about documentation, and if there was one journal, there had to be others. She found the second diary wedged behind a broken shelf in what had once been the children's art room. The walls were still covered with faded finger paintings and construction paper crafts that somehow survived decades of neglect. Butterflies made from coffee filters, handprint turkeys, and crayon drawings of families, stick figures holding hands under bright yellow suns, the innocent artwork of children dreaming of belonging somewhere. This diary was older, dating back to 1975, written in the same careful handwriting but with the confident strokes of a younger woman. Margaret had been in her 30s then, newly in charge of the orphanage after her father Robert's sudden death from a heart attack. The early entries revealed a woman struggling to understand the complex systems her family had put in place. June 12, 1975. Found father's private files today. Dear God, what have we been doing? The legitimate adoptions are barely half our placements. The rest? I don't even know what to call them. Custom orders? There are families paying extraordinary sums for children with specific characteristics, hair color, eye color, even intellectual capabilities somehow predicted from infancy. How is this possible? How long has this been going on? Sarah had to stop reading. She walked to the tall windows that looked out over the overgrown grounds, trying to process what she was learning. Somewhere in this building were records that might tell her not just who her birth parents were, but why she'd been taken from them. The weight of that possibility was overwhelming. She'd spent years imagining scenarios: a teenage mother who couldn't provide for her, parents who died tragically, a family too poor to keep her. The idea that she might have been deliberately separated from parents who wanted her, who might have spent decades searching for her just as she'd searched for them, was almost too painful to consider. But she had to know. Whatever the truth was, however much it might hurt, she needed to understand how she'd ended up on the steps of St. Catherine's with nothing but a blanket and a lie about being loved but unwanted. She returned to the diary, forcing herself to continue reading through Margaret's increasingly desperate entries. The young woman had inherited more than just a building and a business. She'd inherited a legacy of corruption that went back to the orphanage's founding. July 15, 1975. Found Grandfather Jeremiah's original records in the vault. This started even earlier than I thought. The legitimate orphanage was always just a front. From the very beginning, the Hartwells have been in the business of family creation. Wealthy couples who couldn't conceive, families who wanted to improve their bloodlines, even people replacing children they'd lost. We've been playing God for 50 years. The vault. Sarah looked up from the diary, her pulse quickening. Margaret had mentioned a vault, but Jim hadn't shown her anything like that during the tour. She grabbed a flashlight and spent the next hour systematically exploring the basement, looking for any space she might have missed. She found it behind a false wall in what she'd assumed was a storage closet. The entrance was hidden behind a heavy bookshelf that moved on well-oiled hinges despite decades of disuse. Beyond it lay a small room lined with filing cabinets, the walls covered with charts and photographs that made Sarah's blood run cold. The charts showed genetic lineages mapped out like breeding programs. Families were reduced to traits and characteristics, intelligence scores, physical features, medical histories, even personality assessments. The photographs showed children at various ages, but they weren't the kind of pictures you'd expect in an orphanage. These were clinical, almost scientific in their precision. Full face, profile, standing poses that emphasized physical characteristics. Sarah opened the nearest filing cabinet with hands that shook so badly she could barely turn the handle. Inside were hundreds of files, each containing detailed information about children who'd passed through the orphanage. But these weren't the sanitized official records that would have been shared with government agencies. These were the real files, documenting the complex web of lies that had supported 3 generations of illegal operations. She found her own file near the back of the drawer, filed under Chen, Baby Girl, Placement Completed, 1992. The folder was thicker than most, filled with documents that told a story completely different from the one she'd lived her entire life. According to the official record, Sarah Chen had been found on the steps of St. Catherine's Children's Home by Sister Mary Catherine at approximately 6 a.m. on March 20, 1992. The accompanying note expressed a mother's love but inability to care for her child, and no identifying information had been left behind. But the real records painted a picture entirely different. Sarah Chen had been born Sarah Elizabeth Morrison at Millfield General Hospital to David and Linda Morrison, a young couple who'd struggled with infertility for 6 years before finally conceiving naturally. The birth had been complicated, requiring a cesarean section, and Linda had spent several days in intensive care while Sarah remained in the hospital nursery. During those critical days, someone had approached David Morrison with an offer. His wife was unlikely to survive her complications, they told him. His daughter would need extensive medical care that he couldn't afford on a factory worker's salary. But there was a family, wealthy, loving, desperate for a child, who could give Sarah everything he couldn't. They would pay handsomely for the privilege, enough to cover Linda's medical bills and leave him financially stable. The file contained David Morrison's signed statement relinquishing all parental rights, dated 3 days after Sarah's birth. It also contained a death certificate for Linda Morrison, who had supposedly died from surgical complications on March 23, 1992. But there was something else in the file that made Sarah's world tilt off its axis. A handwritten note from Margaret Hartwell dated 6 months later. September 15, 1992. Received word that Linda Morrison has survived her surgery and is asking questions about her daughter's whereabouts. David Morrison has apparently told her the child died during delivery, but she's becoming suspicious. Dr. Brennan has agreed to maintain the fiction for now, but we may need to take additional steps to ensure the Morrison family doesn't pursue this further. The Chen family has already begun bonding with the child, and disruption at this point would be catastrophic for all involved. Sarah slumped against the filing cabinet, the paper scattering from her nerveless fingers. Linda Morrison, her mother. Not only was her birth mother alive, but she'd been searching for answers just like she'd been searching her entire life. She picked up the scattered papers with shaking hands, forcing herself to read every detail. The Morrison family had lived in Millfield until 1995, when they'd moved to Portland, Oregon. Linda Morrison had suffered a nervous breakdown following what she believed was her daughter's death, and David had relocated them across the country, hoping a fresh start would help his wife heal. The file contained their last known address, David's employment records, even copies of letters Linda had written to various agencies trying to get copies of her daughter's death certificate. Requests that have been systematically blocked by Dr. Brennan and the network of officials working with the Hartwell operation. Sarah photographed every document with her phone, her hands steadier now that shock was giving way to determination. She had names, addresses, and most importantly, she had proof of what had been done to her family. The question now was what to do with that information. Should she try to contact her parents directly? What if Linda Morrison had managed to move on with her life, had other children, built a family that didn't include the ghost of the daughter she thought she'd lost? What if reopening those wounds caused more harm than healing? But even as those doubts swirled through her mind, Sarah knew she couldn't stay silent. Too much pain had been caused by the Hartwell family's lies. Too many people had spent decades believing falsehoods about the most fundamental aspects of their lives. She gathered up all the files she could carry and made her way back upstairs to the main floor. The building felt different now, less like a renovation project and more like a crime scene. Every room contained evidence of lives that had been altered, families that had been destroyed and rebuilt according to someone else's vision of what they should be. In the former director's office, she spread the documents across Margaret Hartwell's old desk. The portrait of Jeremiah Hartwell seemed to leer down at her from above the mantelpiece, his painted eyes holding secrets that had finally been dragged into the light. Sarah opened her laptop and began researching. David Morrison, age 58, currently employed as a maintenance supervisor at a lumber mill in Portland. Linda Morrison, age 56, working as a library aide at the local elementary school. No other children listed in any of the public records she could access. They were still alive, still married, still living with the lie that their daughter had died 32 years ago. As the afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, Sarah made her decision. She would contact them, but not yet. First, she needed to understand the full scope of what the Hartwells had done. If her case was part of a larger pattern, there might be other families who deserved to know the truth. She returned to the vault and began systematically going through every file, photographing documents, and creating a digital archive of the Hartwell family's crimes. Case after case revealed the same pattern: babies taken from vulnerable families, sold to wealthy couples, with elaborate lies constructed to prevent anyone from asking too many questions. Some of the stories were even worse than her own. Children had been taken from families experiencing temporary financial difficulties, from single mothers who'd been told their babies hadn't survived childbirth, from parents who'd been convinced they were unfit to raise their own children. The operation had been breathtakingly comprehensive, involving doctors, lawyers, social workers, and government officials. Money had changed hands at every level, ensuring that questions were never asked and records were never examined too closely. By the time darkness fell, Sarah had documented over 200 cases spanning 5 decades. The Hartwell orphanage hadn't just been a business. It had been a machine designed to separate children from their biological families and redistribute them to families with the means to pay for the privilege. She locked the vault and made her way upstairs to the small apartment she'd been setting up on the second floor. Tomorrow she would begin the work of figuring out how to contact the families who'd been affected. Tonight she needed to process the fact that everything she'd believed about her own life had been built on a foundation of lies. Sarah sat by the window in her makeshift bedroom, looking out over the grounds where dozens of stolen children had once played, unaware that their entire lives had been constructed by people who saw them as commodities rather than human beings. But now, the truth was finally coming to light, and Sarah was going to make sure that every family affected by the Hartwell legacy got the answers they deserved, no matter how long it took or how many powerful people had reasons to keep those secrets buried. Sleep didn't come that night. Sarah lay on the narrow cot she had set up in what had once been Margaret Hartwell's private quarters, staring at the ceiling while her mind raced through the implications of what she had discovered. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces from the photographs in the vault. Dozens of children who'd been commodified, traded, their identities erased and rewritten to fit someone else's vision of the perfect family. But now, the truth was finally coming to light, and Sarah was going to make sure that every family affected by the Hartwell legacy got the answers they deserved, no matter how long it took or how many powerful people had reasons to keep those secrets buried.
She started with the most recent cases, figuring those families would be easier to locate and might still be searching for answers. The file labeled Williams Baby Boy Placement Completed 1989 caught her attention because of a detail that made her stomach clench. The infant had been taken from a teenage mother who'd been told he died during delivery, while the adoptive family had been told he was the child of a woman who died in a car accident. Marcus Williams, now Marcus Brennan, according to the adoptive family's name, would be 34 years old. The file contained his current address in Chicago, where he worked as a social worker specializing in family reunification. The irony was so sharp it cut. Sarah spent the morning crafting a letter that wouldn't sound like the ramblings of someone who'd lost touch with reality. How do you tell a stranger that everything they believe about their origins is a lie? How do you explain that you've bought an abandoned orphanage and found evidence that they were stolen from their birth family over 3 decades ago? She settled on honesty, direct and unflinching. Dear Mr. Brennan, my name is Sarah Chen, and I'm writing to you about a matter that may be difficult to hear, but that you have a right to know. I recently purchased the former Hartwell orphanage in Millfield, and while renovating the building, I discovered extensive records documenting illegal adoption practices that operated from the 1920s through the 1990s. According to these records, you were born Marcus Williams on June 15, 1989, to Angela Williams, who was 17 years old at the time. You were not orphaned, and your biological mother did not die during childbirth, as you may have been told. Instead, you were removed from your mother's care through fraudulent means and placed with the Brennan family through falsified documentation. I understand this information must be shocking, and I want you to know that I'm not seeking anything from you. I'm simply trying to ensure that families affected by these practices have access to the truth about their origins. I have copies of all relevant documents and can provide them if you're interested in learning more. Your biological mother's last known address and contact information are included with this letter should you choose to pursue reconnection. Sincerely, Sarah Chen. She printed the letter, along with copies of Marcus's file, and drove to the post office in downtown Millfield. Standing in line behind elderly Mrs. Patterson, who was mailing cookies to her grandson in the military, Sarah felt the surreal disconnect between the mundane normalcy of small-town life and the bombshell she was about to drop into a stranger's world. But as she handed the envelope to the postal clerk, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: purpose. This was bigger than renovating a building or even finding her own family. This was about justice, about giving people back the truth that had been stolen from them. Over the next week, Sarah sent 7 more letters to people whose files she'd found in the vault. Each case was different. Some involved infants taken from young mothers. Others involved children removed from families experiencing temporary difficulties. and a few involved elaborate schemes where children had been kidnapped and their deaths faked to prevent investigations. While she waited for responses, Sarah threw herself into the physical renovation of the orphanage with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She tore out rotted flooring, replaced broken windows, and slowly began transforming the institutional spaces into something that felt more like a home than a warehouse for unwanted children. The work was therapeutic, giving her hands something to do while her mind processed the emotional weight of what she'd discovered. Each room she renovated felt like an act of redemption, a way of honoring the children who'd passed through these halls without knowing their true stories. She was installing new plumbing in what had been the main bathroom when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the area code, Chicago, made her heart race. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was male, careful, with an edge of barely controlled emotion. "Yes, this is Sarah." "This is Marcus Brennan. I received your letter." Sarah set down her wrench and walked to the window, looking out over the grounds where autumn was painting the trees in shades of gold and crimson. "How are you doing with the information?" There was a long pause. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was rough. "I've been a social worker for 12 years. I've reunited hundreds of families, helped children find their biological parents, worked with adoptees searching for their origins, and all that time, I never knew that I was one of them. I can imagine how difficult this must be." "No," Marcus said, and there was steel in his voice now. "I don't think you can. I've spent my entire career helping other people find the truth about their families while living a lie about my own. Do you know what that feels like? Do you know how many times I've sat across from teenagers in foster care and told them that family is about more than biology, that love matters more than genetics?" Sarah closed her eyes. "I found my own file too, Marcus. I've been living the same lie." That seemed to deflate some of his anger. "Jesus. How many of us are there?" "I've found over 200 cases so far, spanning 50 years. Some of the children would be seniors now, others are just entering adulthood. The operation was extensive." "I called her," Marcus said quietly. "Angela Williams, my biological mother. She's been looking for me for 34 years. 34 years, Sarah. She never stopped believing I was alive, even after they showed her a fake death certificate. She moved to Portland and became a private investigator specifically so she could keep searching for me." Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Are you going to meet her?" "Next weekend. She's flying to Chicago." His voice broke slightly. "She kept my room. All these years, she kept my room exactly the way she'd set it up before I was born. She said she couldn't bear to change it because it was the only piece of me she had left." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the empty bathroom for a long time, thinking about the ripple effects of what she was setting in motion. For every joyful reunion, there would also be pain. Adoptive families learning their children hadn't come to them through legitimate channels. Birth families discovering they'd been lied to for decades. Children having to reconcile the lives they'd built with the truth about how those lives had begun. But the alternative, allowing the lies to continue, letting families live with false grief while their children grew up believing they were unwanted, was unthinkable. 2 days later, she received a call from a woman named Patricia Coleman, whose daughter had been taken through the Hartwell operation in 1978. Patricia had spent 45 years believing her child had died from complications during a premature birth. Learning that her daughter was alive, had been raised by another family, and was now a successful pediatrician in Seattle, had caused what she described as a complete emotional collapse. "I mourned her," Patricia sobbed into the phone. "I buried an empty coffin. I visit her grave every year on her birthday, and all this time she was alive, growing up thinking I was dead too." Sarah found herself becoming an informal counselor for the families she contacted, helping them navigate the complex emotions that came with learning their fundamental assumptions about their lives had been wrong. She connected birth parents with their adult children, helped adoptees understand that their origins didn't diminish the love they'd received from their adoptive families, and slowly began to see the healing that could come from truth, however painful. But it was her own truth that remained the most frightening to confront. David and Linda Morrison lived less than 2,000 miles away. She had their phone number, their address, even photos from Linda's Facebook page showing a woman with Sarah's same dark hair and determined jawline. Every night, she practiced what she might say if she called them. Every morning, she found reasons to wait another day. What if they'd built a life that didn't have room for the daughter they thought they'd lost? What if learning she was alive caused more pain than healing? The decision was made for her on a Thursday afternoon in late October. She was painting the former director's office, trying to cover decades of water stains and institutional beige, when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a Portland area code. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was soft, tentative, unmistakably feminine. Sarah's brush clattered to the floor, sending drops of white paint across the hardwood. "Yes?" "My name is Linda Morrison. I think you might be my daughter." The world seemed to stop. Sarah sank into Margaret Hartwell's old chair, her free hand gripping the desk so tightly her knuckles went white. "How did you find me?" "Marcus Brennan contacted us. He said you were the one who discovered the records, and he thought we had a right to know that our daughter might be alive. He gave us your name, said you'd found evidence that you were born Sarah Elizabeth Morrison." "I was," Sarah whispered. The sound that came through the phone was part sob, part gasp, entirely heartbreak and relief tangled together. "Oh my God, it's really you. You're alive. My baby is alive." For several minutes, neither of them could speak coherently. They cried, laughed, asked desperate questions about each other's lives. Linda told her about the decades of grief, the failed attempts to get records from the hospital, the way she'd never been able to accept that her daughter was really gone. Sarah told her about growing up in foster care, about becoming a mechanic, about the strange series of events that had led her to buy the orphanage where the truth was hidden. "I want to see you," Linda said finally. "Your father and I both want to see you. We could drive out there, or you could come here, or we could meet somewhere in between. I don't care where or when. I just need to hold my daughter." Sarah looked around the office that had been the center of so much pain and deception, and then out the window at the grounds where she was slowly building something new from the ruins of the Hartwell legacy. "Come here," she said. "Come see what I've built." As she hung up the phone, Sarah realized that buying the orphanage hadn't just given her shelter, it had given her the tools to heal wounds that went back generations. In 3 days, she would meet the parents who'd spent 32 years mourning her, and together they would begin the work of reclaiming the family that had been stolen from them by people who saw love as a commodity to be bought and sold. The truth was finally coming home. 3 days. Sarah had 3 days to prepare for a moment she'd dreamed about her entire life, but never truly believed would happen. The orphanage, which had felt like a project and then a mission, now felt like a stage where the most important scene of her life would unfold. She attacked the preparation with the same methodical precision she brought to engine repair. The main parlor, where families would once have met with potential adoptive children, became her focus. She stripped away years of grime and institutional neglect, revealing beautiful hardwood floors and intricate crown molding that spoke of the building's original grandeur.
That as she worked, doubt crept in like cold air through the cracks she hadn't yet sealed. What if the people driving toward her weren't the parents she'd imagined all these years? What if 32 years of separation had created a gulf too wide to bridge? What if they looked at her and saw not the daughter they'd lost, but a stranger who happened to share their DNA? The night before David and Linda Morrison were scheduled to arrive, Sarah found herself in the vault, surrounded by the files that had started this journey. She pulled out her own folder and spread the contents across the table, studying the documents that told the story of her separation from her family. Among the papers was something she'd missed during her initial discovery, a small envelope marked "Personal Effects, Baby Morrison." Inside was a hospital bracelet,
impossibly tiny, with Baby Girl Morrison printed in faded black ink. There was also a single photograph, a Polaroid of a newborn Sarah, perhaps hours old, being held by a woman with exhausted eyes and a radiant smile. Sarah had never seen a picture of herself as a baby. St. Catherine's had no records from her first days of life, and she'd spent years wondering what she'd looked like, whether she'd been a fussy baby or a quiet one, whether anyone had held her with love before she'd been passed along to strangers. Now she knew. Linda Morrison had held her with the fierce protectiveness she could see even in the faded photograph. And somewhere in this building, someone had coldly calculated how to separate them forever. She locked the vault and made her way upstairs to the small bedroom she'd created in what had once been Margaret Hartwell's quarters. Tomorrow, she would meet the people who'd given her life. Tonight, she needed to figure out how to be their daughter. Sarah woke before dawn, her stomach knotted with anticipation and terror. She'd changed clothes 4 times, settling finally on jeans and a simple blue sweater. Nothing too formal, nothing that looked like she was trying too hard. She wanted to look like herself, whoever that turned out to be. She spent the morning doing final touches around the orphanage, arranging the few pieces of furniture she'd managed to salvage and restore, making sure the coffee maker worked, checking that the small bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked from the grounds looked welcoming rather than desperate. At exactly 2 p.m., she heard the crunch of tires on the gravel drive. Through the front window, she watched a silver Honda Accord pull up to the front steps. For a moment, the car just sat there, engine ticking as it cooled, and Sarah realized that the people inside were probably as terrified as she was. Then the doors opened. David Morrison stepped out first, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and the kind of hands that spoke of a lifetime of physical work. He moved around to the passenger side and opened the door for a woman with dark hair streaked with silver, wearing a green cardigan that brought out eyes the same shade as Sarah's own. Linda Morrison stood by the car for a long moment, one hand pressed to her mouth, staring at the orphanage where her daughter's life had been stolen and 32 years later, reclaimed. Sarah opened a front door and stepped onto the porch. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter. For several heartbeats, the 3 of them simply looked at each other across the space that separated the porch from the driveway. Then Linda Morrison whispered, "My God, you have your father's chin." And Sarah found herself laughing and crying at the same time because it was such a perfectly normal thing to say, the kind of observations mothers make about their children every day. She walked down the steps, and Linda met her halfway, and suddenly Sarah was being held by arms that ached to hold her for 32 years. Linda was smaller than Sarah had expected, but her embrace was fierce, desperate, like she was trying to make up for every hug they'd missed. "I knew," she whispered against Sarah's hair. "I knew you were alive. I felt it in my bones, even when everyone told me I was crazy for hoping." David joined them and wrapped his arms around both women, and for a moment they stood in the shadow of the building that had torn their family apart, finally whole again. When they eventually separated, Linda kept hold of Sarah's hands, studying her face with the intensity of someone memorizing something precious. She said, "You're so beautiful. You look like your grandmother, my mother. She died hoping she'd meet you someday." They went inside and Sarah gave them the same tour she'd given herself weeks ago, but now she saw it through their eyes. This wasn't just a renovation project or a repository of evidence. This was the place where their daughter had been processed like a commodity, where paperwork had been filed to erase her from their lives forever. In the main parlor, David stopped in front of a large portrait of the Hartwell family, 3 generations of people who'd built their fortune on stolen children. His jaw clenched, and Sarah could see the anger he was working to contain. He said, "They told me you died. They said Linda was going to die too, that the complications were too severe. They made it sound like giving you up was the only way to save your life." He turned to look at Sarah directly. "I signed those papers thinking I was choosing your survival over my own heartbreak." Linda took his hand. "We both made the best decisions we could with the information we had. The people who lied to us are the ones who should carry the guilt."
They sat in the parlor as the afternoon light slanted through the tall windows, filling in 32 years of separation with the kind of awkward, eager conversation that happens when strangers realize they share everything important and nothing trivial. Sarah learned that she had her father's mechanical aptitude. David had worked as a machinist before moving into mill maintenance, and he'd spent his free time restoring classic cars. She had her mother's stubbornness and her way of tilting her head when she was thinking. Linda had become a library aide partly because she'd spent so many years researching, trying to find any trace of the daughter she'd been told was dead. "We tried to have other children," Linda admitted, "but I couldn't carry another pregnancy to term. The doctor said it was trauma, that my body was rejecting the pregnancies because emotionally I was still grieving for you." She wiped tears from her eyes. "We talked about adoption, but I couldn't bear the thought of raising someone else's child when I didn't know what had happened to my own." They talked about Sarah's childhood and foster care, her relationship with old Pete, her decision to become a mechanic. David's face darkened when she described some of the homes she'd been placed in, the ones where she'd learned to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible. "You should have been home with us," he said. "You should have been safe." "I survived," Sarah said. "I became someone I'm proud of. The circumstances were awful, but I'm not a victim. I'm a fighter, just like Mom apparently is." Linda laughed through her tears. "You definitely got my stubborn streak. I drove your father crazy during those first years, insisting that you were still alive somewhere, hiring private investigators we couldn't afford, following every lead no matter how far-fetched." As the sun began to set, Sarah took them down to the basement workshop that had clinched her decision to buy the building. David's eyes lit up as he examined the tools and workbenches, and he and Sarah fell into easy conversation about engine repair and metalworking. "This is where Margaret Hartwell worked. She was a mechanic before she took over the orphanage. I think she might have been the only one who felt genuine guilt about what they were doing." Linda picked up one of Margaret's old journals from the workbench. She documented everything, even her own complicity and guilt. In a strange way, that made it possible for us to find each other. They had dinner in the small kitchen Sarah had created from one of the former office spaces, takeout from the only decent restaurant in Millfield, eaten off mismatched plates by the light of battery-powered lanterns because she was still working on the electrical system in that part of the building. It should have been awkward eating with strangers who happened to be her parents. Instead, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. They shared stories, compared scars, and discovered that they all had the same habit of talking with their hands when they got excited about something. "Are you planning to stay here?" David asked as they cleaned up. "In this building, I mean?" Sarah looked around the kitchen, then out the window at the grounds she'd been slowly reclaiming from decades of neglect. "I think so, at least for now. There are still so many families who don't know the truth about their children. Someone needs to help them find each other." "That's a big responsibility to take on alone," Linda said. "Maybe I don't have to be alone anymore." The words hung in the air between them, carrying weight and possibility, and the tentative hope that maybe, despite everything, they could build something resembling a normal family relationship. David cleared his throat. "We were thinking, if you're open to it, maybe we could help with the renovations, with contacting other families. Linda's research skills could be useful, and I'm pretty handy with construction work." Sarah felt something tight and guarded in her chest begin to loosen. "You'd want to do that?" "Honey," Linda said softly, "we missed 32 years of your life. If you'll let us, we'd like to be part of whatever comes next." That night, David and Linda stayed in the small motel in downtown Millfield, but they came back first thing in the morning with coffee and pastries from the diner. They spent the day working together, David assessing what needed to be done to make the building fully habitable, Linda organizing the files from the vault into a more systematic database, and Sarah continuing her methodical renovation of the common areas. It should have been awkward, eating with strangers who happened to be her parents. Instead,
It felt like the most natural thing in the world. They shared stories, compared scars, and discovered that they all had the same habit of talking with their hands when they got excited about something. As their car disappeared down the tree-lined drive, Sarah stood on the front porch of the orphanage and realized something had fundamentally changed. She was no longer alone. She had parents who'd spent 32 years hoping to find her, and she had a purpose that went beyond her own healing. The building behind her still held secrets, still housed the evidence of decades of crimes committed against families like hers. But now it also held something else, the possibility that truth, however long delayed, could still find its way home.
And Sarah was just getting started. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the orphanage grounds in snow that made the building look like something from a Gothic novel. But inside, the place hummed with purposeful activity. David had arrived 3 weeks after the reunion, his pickup truck loaded with tools and a determination to help his daughter turn the monument to family destruction into something that could heal the wounds it had created. Sarah watched him work with the same methodical precision she brought to engine repair, and she realized how much of her approach to problems came from genetics rather than learned behavior. They had the same way of studying a broken thing before touching it, the same habit of organizing tools in precise order, the same satisfaction in work that required both skill and strength. Linda had transformed Margaret Hartwell's old office into a research center that would have impressed any private investigator. She'd covered the walls with timelines, family trees, and maps showing the geographical spread of the Hartwell operation. Her background as a librarian had given her skills in information organization that proved invaluable in untangling the web of lies that spanned 5 decades. "I've been cross-referencing the files with missing person reports from the same time periods," Linda explained to Sarah one morning as they sat surrounded by stacks of documents. "The patterns are disturbing. Children who were reported as runaways, infants who allegedly died in hospitals with no burial records, families who suddenly moved away with no forwarding addresses." Sarah studied the map where Linda had been placing pins for each case they'd verified. The markers clustered around major metropolitan areas, but there were outliers too. Rural communities where a single missing child might not attract much attention. Small towns where everyone trusted the local doctor's word about birth complications. It's bigger than just the orphanage, Sarah realized. They had connections everywhere. Much bigger. I found evidence of similar operations in at least 12 other states, different names, different buildings, but the same methodology. And they were all connected through a network of professionals, doctors, lawyers, social workers, even judges. The scope of what they were uncovering was staggering. What had started as an investigation into Sarah's own origins had evolved into something that looked like organized crime on a massive scale. Thousands of children, hundreds of families, decades of systematic family destruction disguised as charitable work. Their breakthrough came when Linda discovered a box of correspondence in the orphanage's old administrative office. The letters, dating from 1975 to 1992, were communications between Margaret Hartwell and Dr. Harrison Brennan, the same Dr. Brennan mentioned in the medical records they'd found. But Dr. Brennan hadn't just been providing falsified medical records for the Hartwell operation. He'd been coordinating similar schemes across the entire region, serving as a central hub for what amounted to an interstate trafficking network. "Listen to this," Linda said, reading from a letter dated 1983. "The Seattle placement went smoothly, but the Portland family is asking too many questions about the child's medical history. Recommend we use the premature death documentation for future cases in that market. The grief counselor you recommended has been very effective in discouraging follow-up inquiries." Sarah felt sick. They weren't just reading about crimes. They were reading about the systematic destruction of parental bonds, the careful manipulation of grief to prevent families from searching for their stolen children. "Mom," she said, testing the word that still felt new in her mouth, "this Dr. Brennan, is he still alive?" Linda's smile at hearing herself called Mom was quickly replaced by grim determination. Very much alive, Dr. Harrison Brennan, age 78, retired but still living in his mansion outside Portland. Still practicing medicine on a consulting basis. Still respected in his community. That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the man who'd signed her fake death certificate, who'd told her father that giving her up was the only way to save her, who'd spent decades convincing grieving mothers that their instincts about their living children were just manifestations of denial and trauma. She'd been planning to work within the system, to contact social services and law enforcement with the evidence they'd gathered. But Dr. Brennan's continued freedom felt like an injustice that demanded more immediate action. The next morning, she found David in the basement workshop, installing new wiring to bring the electrical system up to code. She told him about Dr. Brennan, about the evidence of his central role in the trafficking network. David's jaw clenched as he listened, his hand stilling on the wire he'd been stripping. This man told me my wife was going to die, that my daughter had no chance of survival without the kind of medical care I couldn't provide. He looked me in the eye and made me believe that signing those papers was an act of love. What do you think we should do? David set down his tools and looked at his daughter. Really looked at her, seeing not just the adult she'd become, but the baby he'd been tricked into giving away. I think, he said slowly, that Dr. Harrison Brennan needs to understand what he's done to real people. Not just signatures on documents, but actual families.
The woman who answered the door was clearly household staff, uniformed, professional, probably used to turning away solicitors and unexpected visitors. But when Sarah explained that she was there to discuss medical records from the 1990s, the woman's expression changed. Dr. Brennan doesn't see patients anymore, she said carefully. I'm not a patient. I'm someone whose life was destroyed by his criminal activities, and I'm here to give him a chance to explain himself before I go to the authorities. The directness of that statement seemed to catch the woman off guard. She disappeared into the house, returning a few minutes later with a request that Sarah wait in the front parlor. The room was a shrine to respectability. Medical degrees and awards covering the walls, photographs showing Dr. Brennan with politicians and celebrities, expensive furniture that spoke of a life built on the proceeds of his crimes. When Dr. Harrison Brennan finally appeared, Sarah was struck by how ordinary he looked. Not the monster she'd imagined, but simply an elderly man in an expensive cardigan, walking with a slight limp that spoke of age rather than villainy. Ms. Chen, I presume? His voice was cultured, careful. I understand you have some questions about old medical records. I have questions about why you told David Morrison that his daughter died during delivery when you knew she was alive and healthy. The color drained from Dr. Brennan's face. For a moment he said nothing, and Sarah could see him calculating, trying to figure out how much she knew and how much danger he was in. I think there's been some misunderstanding, he said finally. I treated many patients over the years, and memory can be fallible when discussing events from decades ago. Sarah opened the folder she'd brought and spread copies of documents across his coffee table. Medical records, correspondence, financial transactions that clearly showed his involvement in the trafficking network. Your memory seems to have been quite detailed when you were documenting these transactions, she said, particularly the payments you received for providing falsified death certificates. Dr. Brennan sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 78 years. You don't understand the context. The families we worked with were desperate. These were children who would have ended up in overcrowded state facilities, raised by the system instead of loving families. Loving families like David and Linda Morrison, who spent 32 years mourning the daughter you stole from them. The Morrison case was complicated. The mother's medical condition was severe. The prognosis was uncertain. Linda Morrison survived her complications and lived to search for her daughter for 3 decades. You knew she was alive when you told David she was dying. You knew I was alive when you signed my death certificate. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of crimes that could no longer be hidden behind medical terminology and charitable justifications. "What do you want?" Dr. Brennan asked finally. "I want you to help me contact every family affected by your network. I want you to provide detailed information about every case you were involved with, and I want you to face the consequences of what you've done." "That's impossible. Many of those records were destroyed years ago. And the legal implications, there's no statute of limitations on what you're describing." Sarah leaned forward, letting him see the anger she'd been carefully controlling. "Dr. Brennan, you spent decades playing God with other people's families. You separated children from parents who loved them and convinced those parents that their grief was irrational. You built this house and funded your retirement with money you earned by destroying families." She gestured around the expensive room. "This comfort you've been living in, it was purchased with the tears of mothers who were told their babies were dead. Every meal you've eaten, every vacation you've taken, every night you've slept peacefully in this house was paid for by the suffering you caused." Dr. Brennan's composure finally cracked. "We helped people, childless couples who desperately wanted families, children who needed homes. The system was broken. We found ways to make it work." "You found ways to profit from human misery. There's a difference." Sarah gathered up the documents and stood to leave. "You have 1 week to decide how you want to handle this. You can work with me to help reunite the families you separated, or you can explain your actions to federal investigators. But this ends now. The network you built, the lies you've maintained, the families you've kept apart, it all ends now." As she walked back to her car, Sarah felt the weight of 32 years of questions finally settling into answers. Not comfortable answers, not the kind that made everything make sense, but answers nonetheless. Dr. Brennan represented more than just one corrupt doctor. He was the living embodiment of a system that treated children like commodities and parents like obstacles to profitable transactions. Confronting him hadn't provided the satisfaction she'd expected, but it had given her something more valuable, the certainty that what she was doing was necessary. On the drive back to Millfield, she called Linda and David to report on the meeting. They listened in silence as she described Dr. Brennan's lack of remorse, his attempts to justify the unjustifiable, his obvious terror at being held accountable for his actions. "What's next?" Linda asked. "We give him a week to cooperate. If he doesn't, we take everything we have to the FBI. Either way, we keep working to reunite families. There are hundreds of people out there who deserve to know the truth about their origins. And if he tries to run or destroy evidence or contact other people who were involved," Sarah smiled grimly, "then he'll discover that the Morrison family is much more persistent than he probably remembers. We spent 32 years finding each other. We can certainly spend a few more days making sure he faces justice." The network that had separated her from her family was about to discover that Sarah Chen, Sarah Morrison, wasn't just another stolen child who'd quietly disappeared into the system. She was a woman who fixed things that were broken, and she'd found the biggest repair job of her life. Dr. Brennan didn't wait a week. Sarah discovered this when she arrived at the orphanage on Tuesday morning to find the front door standing open, cold winter air whistling through the hallways she and David had spent weeks insulating. Her first thought was that they'd forgotten to lock up properly the night before, but the moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The research center Linda had created in Margaret Hartwell's old office had been systematically destroyed. Filing cabinets were overturned, their contents scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The timeline Linda had carefully constructed on the wall had been torn down, leaving only fragments of tape and paper clinging to the paint. The computer they'd been using to digitize records was missing entirely, leaving only the tangle of disconnected cables. But it was the message spray-painted across the back wall that made Sarah's blood run cold. Some secrets should stay buried. She called Linda and David immediately, her voice shaking as she described the destruction. They arrived within an hour, David's face grim as he surveyed the damage, Linda standing silent among the ruins of weeks of meticulous work. "They took everything," Linda said quietly, kneeling to gather scattered photographs of children whose stories they'd been trying to piece together. "The backup drives, the printed files, even the notebooks with my handwritten research." David examined the broken lock on the front door with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his life working with his hands. This wasn't random vandalism. They knew exactly what they were looking for and how to find it. "Someone's been watching us," Sarah said, as David installed new locks on all the exterior doors. "They knew our routines, knew when the building would be empty, knew exactly where we kept the most sensitive materials." That evening, as they sat in the small kitchen Sarah had created from one of the former offices, sharing takeout and trying to process what had happened, Linda's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Brennan's number. Sarah answered, putting the call on speaker so her parents could hear. Dr. Brennan's voice was different from their previous conversation, shakier, more desperate. "Miss Chen, we need to talk. What happened at your building today, that wasn't my doing. You've stirred up something much bigger and more dangerous than you realize." "Bigger than a network that stole children from their families for 50 years? Sarah's voice was ice cold. "You don't understand. The people involved in this, some of them are still very powerful. Judges, politicians, business leaders. They have resources you can't imagine, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect themselves." "Are you threatening us, Dr. Brennan?" "I'm trying to warn you. After you left yesterday, I got calls. People I haven't spoken to in years asking about what you knew, what evidence you had. They're scared, and scared, powerful people can be extremely dangerous." "Who called you?" There was a long pause before Dr. Brennan answered. "Judge Harrison Caldwell. He was involved in approving many of the adoptions, making sure the legal paperwork was processed without too much scrutiny. Attorney Margaret Stone. She handled the legal aspects of many placements. State Senator Robert Hayes. His campaign was funded in part by grateful adoptive families." The names meant nothing to Sarah, but Linda was already reaching for her laptop, ready to start researching the people Dr. Brennan was naming. "They know about the files you've been collecting. They know you've been contacting affected families. They see you as a threat to everything they've built in the years since the network officially shut down." "Good," Sarah said simply. "They should be threatened. What they did was monstrous." "Miss Chen, I'm an old man with terminal cancer. I have nothing left to lose by telling you the truth. But these people, they have careers, reputations, families of their own. They won't hesitate to destroy you if they think it's necessary to protect themselves." After hanging up, the three of them sat in silence for a long time. The orphanage, which had felt like a sanctuary where they could safely pursue the truth, suddenly felt exposed and vulnerable. "We could stop," Linda said quietly. "We found each other, reunited our family. Maybe that's enough." But even as she said it, Sarah could see in her mother's eyes the same stubborn refusal to give up that had driven her to search for her daughter for 32 years. "We could," Sarah agreed. "But what about Marcus Brennan's mother, who kept his room ready for 3 decades? What about all the other families still living with lies? What about the children who are now adults, still thinking they were unwanted when they were actually stolen?" David stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "They made one mistake. They showed us that we're on the right track. If we weren't close to something important, they wouldn't have bothered trying to stop us." "But we've lost everything," Linda protested. "All our research, all our evidence." "Not everything," Sarah said, and for the first time since discovering the break-in, she smiled. "We may have lost the files, but we didn't lose the people. Marcus Brennan, Patricia Coleman, all the other families we've contacted, they're still out there, and they still remember their stories. And there's something else." She led them down to the basement workshop, to a corner where she'd been storing some of Margaret Hartwell's personal belongings that she'd found scattered throughout the building. Hidden beneath a stack of old mechanical journals was a metal box that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. Inside the box were items that the vandals had missed because they'd been hidden in plain sight among things that looked like ordinary shop supplies. More correspondence between Dr. Brennan and other network members, financial records showing payments between various participants, and most importantly, a detailed list of contacts, names, addresses, and phone numbers of everyone who'd been involved in the operation at various levels. Margaret Hartwell kept insurance policies, Sarah realized, as she spread the documents across the workbench. She documented everything because she knew that someday someone might come looking for answers. Linda picked up a letter dated just a few months before the orphanage had been shut down. It was addressed to Margaret from someone signing himself only as R.H., likely Senator Robert Hayes based on the letterhead. My dear Margaret, your concerns about increased scrutiny are understandable, but premature. Our contacts in the relevant agencies have assured us that the recent inquiries will be handled discreetly. However, if you continue to express doubts about the program's continuation, we may need to consider whether your emotional attachment to individual cases is compromising your judgment about the greater good we're accomplishing. That sounds like a threat, David observed. It was, Sarah said, thinking about Margaret Hartwell's final diary entries about the woman who'd found herself trapped in a system she'd come to despise but couldn't escape. They were pressuring her to keep quiet, probably threatening her, just like they're threatening us now. As they studied the documents, a picture emerged of a network that had evolved far beyond the Hartwell orphanage. By the 1990s, the operation had expanded to include multiple institutions across several states, with a sophisticated system of financial and legal protections designed to shield the participants from prosecution. But the documents also revealed something else. The network hadn't really shut down when the Hartwell orphanage closed. It had simply adapted, moving to private adoption agencies, international adoption services, and other venues where desperate families and available children could be brought together for the right price. This is still happening, Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. They're still out there, still separating families, still treating children like commodities. Sarah felt something crystallize inside her, a determination that went beyond personal healing or family reunification. The break-in hadn't been intended to stop them. It had been intended to scare them. But all it really had done was show her that the fight was bigger and more important than she had originally understood. Then we need to stop them, she said simply. Not just expose what happened in the past, but stop what's happening now. How? David asked. We're three people going up against a network that includes judges and senators and people with the resources to break into buildings and steal evidence. Sarah looked around the basement workshop, where she'd first felt at home in the orphanage, at the tools that had been left behind by a woman who'd tried to fix things even when the system was designed to stay broken. The same way we fix anything else that's broken, she said, one piece at a time with patience and persistence in the right tools. She gestured at the documents they just discovered. And now we have better tools. That night, as they made plans to digitize and secure Margaret Hartwell's hidden files, to reach out to journalists and law enforcement agencies, to build a case that couldn't be destroyed by breaking into a single building, Sarah realized that the break-in had actually accomplished something the perpetrators never intended. It had transformed her personal quest for answers into something much larger. She was no longer just Sarah Chen, the mechanic who'd bought an abandoned orphanage. She was no longer even just Sarah Morrison, the daughter who'd been reunited with her family. She was part of something bigger now, a force for justice that the network's power and influence couldn't intimidate. They'd spent decades counting on the silence of their victims, on the shame and helplessness of separated families, but they never faced a family like the Morrisons, people who'd spent 32 years refusing to give up hope, who'd survived decades of grief and still chose to fight for others who were living the same nightmare. The network had made its move. Now it was time for the Morrison family to make theirs. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the main parlor of what was no longer the Hartwell orphanage, but had become the Morrison Family Reunion Center. The room buzzed with conversation as nearly 50 people filled the space. Adults who'd been stolen as children, elderly parents who'd never stopped searching, adoptive families learning the truth about their children's origins, and siblings who'd been separated for decades. The transformation of the building mirrored the transformation of the lives it now served. Where institutional beige had once covered the walls, warm colors now welcomed the visitors. The dining hall had been converted into a conference center where families could meet in privacy. The old dormitories had become comfortable guest rooms for people traveling from across the country to reconnect with their biological families. But it was the wall in the main entrance that told the real story of what they had accomplished. Where Margaret Hartwell's guilty documentation had once been hidden, there was now a memorial wall covered with photographs and stories of the families who'd been reunited through their work. Marcus Brennan and his mother Angela, both beaming in a photo taken at his Chicago apartment. Patricia Coleman embracing the daughter she'd mourned for 45 years. Dozens of other families, their faces showing the complex emotions of people processing joy, grief, and healing all at once. The legal victory had come faster than anyone expected. Margaret Hartwell's hidden files combined with Dr. Brennan's eventual cooperation and testimony from affected families had provided federal investigators with enough evidence to bring charges against 12 members of the trafficking network. Judge Harrison Caldwell had resigned from the bench rather than face prosecution. Senator Robert Hayes had been arrested at his campaign headquarters. Attorney Margaret Stone had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. Dr. Brennan himself had died 3 weeks before his scheduled court appearance, the terminal cancer he'd mentioned finally claiming him, but not before he'd spent his final months helping investigators map the full scope of the network's operations and providing detailed information about cases that spanned 5 decades. The media attention had been overwhelming at first. Sarah found herself giving interviews to national news programs, testifying before congressional committees, and speaking at conferences about child welfare and adoption reform. But the real satisfaction came from the quieter work. The phone calls from newly reunited families, the letters from people who'd finally learned the truth about their origins, the gradual healing of wounds that had festered for decades. Linda had left her job at the library and now worked full-time as the center's research coordinator, using her skills to help other families navigate the complex process of proving their connections to children who'd been taken from them. David had officially retired and served as the facility's maintenance director, though his real job seemed to be providing a steady, calm presence for families processing traumatic revelations. And Sarah had found herself becoming something she'd never expected to be: an advocate, a healer, a bridge between families that had been torn apart by people who saw love as a commodity to be bought and sold. The reunion taking place today was special because it involved the first family they'd helped reconnect whose case had been completely separate from the Hartwell operation. The network's methods had been replicated in institutions across the country, and the Morrison Family Reunion Center had become a hub for investigations into similar crimes committed elsewhere. Jennifer Walsh had contacted them 3 months ago after seeing Sarah's story on the news. She'd been told her son had died during a difficult delivery in 1988, but something about the circumstances had never felt right. Using techniques they'd developed while investigating the Hartwell files, Linda had tracked down evidence that Jennifer's son was alive and had been placed with a family in Denver through a network connected to, but separate from, the Hartwell operation. Now, Jennifer sat across from Michael Chen, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, a 35-year-old teacher who'd grown up believing his birth mother had died in a car accident. Their conversation was awkward, hesitant, but filled with the same desperate hope Sarah remembered from her own reunion with David and Linda. "I brought this," Jennifer said, pulling a small wrapped package from her purse.
It was supposed to be your coming home outfit. I never could bring myself to throw it away." Michael unwrapped the package with shaking hands, revealing a tiny blue onesie with Mommy's little star embroidered on the front. For a moment, the room fell silent, except for the sound of Jennifer's quiet crying. "I kept it for 35 years. I knew you were alive. I felt it in my heart every single day." Sarah watched from across the room, remembering her own reunion with David and Linda, understanding now that the awkwardness and overwhelming emotion were just the beginning. The real work of building relationships would take years, but the foundation was there. The unbreakable bond between parents and children that no amount of lies could fully sever. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself in conversation with a woman named Dr. Raquel Martinez, a pediatrician who'd driven up from Boston specifically to see the center and learn about their work. "I've been seeing patterns in my practice. Children whose medical histories don't quite match their family backgrounds, adoption records that seem too perfect, families asking questions that suggest they suspect something isn't right about their children's origins." "How many cases are we talking about?" Sarah asked.
In my practice alone, maybe a dozen over the past few years. But I've been talking to colleagues, and we think there might be current operations using similar methods. More sophisticated now, harder to detect, but following the same basic pattern of separating children from families who want them and placing them with families who can pay premium prices. Sarah felt the familiar chill of recognizing something evil still operating in the shadows. The legal victories had been satisfying, but they'd only addressed historical crimes. If similar operations were still functioning, there were children being separated from their families right now, parents being told lies about their children's fates, families being destroyed for profit. "Would you be interested in helping us investigate?" Sarah asked. "We've learned a lot about how these networks operate, how to trace their methods, how to find evidence they think they've hidden." Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. "I became a pediatrician to help children. If there are children being stolen from their families, then stopping that is exactly the kind of help they need most." Later that evening, after the last families had departed and the center was quiet, Sarah found herself in the basement workshop where this journey had truly begun. The space had been renovated into a proper office, but she'd kept Margaret Hartwell's old workbench and many of her tools. Sometimes, when she was processing particularly difficult cases, she found that working with her hands helped her think more clearly. David and Linda joined her, as they often did at the end of long days, sharing coffee and the comfortable silence of people who'd learned to be a family despite starting as strangers. "How many families have we helped now?" David asked, gesturing toward the memorial wall visible through the workshop's new window. 237 confirmed reunions, Linda answered promptly. Another 115 cases where we've provided information that's helping families understand their origins, even if full reunification isn't possible. "And how many more are still out there?" Sarah wondered aloud. "Based on the documentation we found, probably thousands affected by historical operations. And if Dr. Martinez is right about current activities," Linda shrugged, "the work is never going to be finished." Sarah picked up one of Margaret Hartwell's old wrenches, feeling the weight of well-made tools in hands that had learned their craft from desperation and determination. Maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to finish the work, but to make sure it continues until no more families are being destroyed. "Speaking of continuation," David said, his voice carrying the careful tone he used when he was about to share news he wasn't sure how Sarah would receive. "We got a call today from the state of Oregon. They want to fund a second center, somewhere on the East Coast where it would be easier for families in that region to access our services." Sarah looked up from the wrench. "That would mean..." "It would mean expanding beyond what we can handle from this location. It would mean training other people to do this work, developing systems that can be replicated, turning what we've built here into something bigger." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. What they'd created in Millfield had grown organically from Sarah's personal quest for answers and her family's determination to heal old wounds. Could that kind of intimate, personal approach to reunification work on a larger scale? But as she thought about Dr. Martinez's suspicions about current trafficking operations, about the thousands of families still living with lies about their origins, about the children who might be separated from their parents tomorrow or next week, she realized the question wasn't whether they could expand their work. The question was whether they could afford not to. "We'd need to be careful," she said finally. "This isn't just about processing paperwork or matching names in databases. It's about helping people rebuild their entire understanding of who they are and where they come from. We know. That's why they want us to design the program. They don't want to replicate some government bureaucracy. They want to replicate what we've built here."
Sarah looked around the workshop where she'd first felt at home in the orphanage, where she'd discovered the truth about her own origins, where she learned that sometimes the most important repairs couldn't be made with tools, but required patience, persistence, and the willingness to believe that broken things could be made whole again. "Then we'll do it," she said. "We'll teach other people how to fix what's been broken. We'll build a network of healing to replace the network of harm." As they walked back upstairs to the living quarters they'd created on the second floor, Sarah caught sight of their reflection in one of the tall windows. 3 people who'd found each other against impossible odds, who'd built something meaningful from the ruins of other people's crimes, who'd chosen to use their healing to help others heal. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, dusting the grounds where stolen children had once played while dreaming of families they'd been told they'd never have. Inside, the building that had once been a monument to family destruction had become a beacon of hope for people searching for the truth about their origins. The Hartwell orphanage was gone, its legacy of lies finally exposed, and its victims finally free to reclaim their real stories. In its place stood something unprecedented, a family that had been torn apart by deception and rebuilt by truth, now dedicating their lives to helping other families do the same. Sarah Chen Morrison, she'd legally changed her name to include both her adoptive and birth family surnames, was no longer the woman who'd bought a rusted container of secrets. She was the woman who'd opened that container, faced the truth it contained, and used that truth to build something beautiful from the ruins of something terrible. And she was just getting started. The network that had stolen her from her family made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that separated families would remain isolated, that victims would stay silent, that the powerful would always triumph over the powerless. They'd never imagined that one woman's quest to renovate an abandoned building would become a movement that gave thousands of families the chance to come home. But then again, they'd never met the Morrison family.